The atmosphere inside the arena had shifted long before the lights went out. It wasn't the electric buzz of anticipation that usually precedes a main event, nor was it the fatigued lull of a crowd that had seen too much. It was something heavier, a distinct drop in barometric pressure that you feel in your sinuses before a thunderstorm breaks. The previous match had ended in a clumsy disqualification, leaving the audience in a state of agitated confusion. They were restless. Shifting in their plastic seats, checking their phones, the collective hum of 50,000 people sounding less like excitement and more like anxiety. The commentary team was filling the dead air with standard platitudes, trying to pivot the narrative back to the championship picture, but their voices sounded thin against the growing unrest. You could see it in the way the camera operators were glancing away from the viewfinders, looking toward the stage not with readiness, but with uncertainty. The script felt loose, the production seemingly hanging by a thread, and for a company that prides itself on polished perfection, this ragged edge was the first sign that the night was about to bleed into reality. On the Titantron, the scheduled graphic for the Women's Championship celebration flickered. It wasn't a clean transition. It was a digital stutter. A momentary tear in the LED fabric that turned the champion's face into a distorted grimace of pixels. The audio in the arena dipped, a low-frequency thrum replacing the entrance music, vibrating the floorboards enough that the fans in the front row looked down at their feet. This wasn't the pyro-laden spectacle they were promised. It felt like a technical failure, the kind that usually leads to an awkward commercial break. The referee in the ring was communicating frantically with the timekeeper, tapping his earpiece with a look of genuine frustration. This wasn't acting. The confusion rippling through the ringside area was too messy, too uncoordinated to be a work. The champion stood in the center of the ring, her microphone lowered, her rehearsed promo dying in her throat as she scanned the hard cam for a cue that wasn't coming. The darkness didn't fall all at once. It crept in, section by section, as if the power was being drained from the building by a massive, unseen parasite. First the upper decks went black, then the loge, until only the ring was illuminated in a stark, harsh spotlight that looked less like a stage and more like an interrogation room. The silence that followed wasn't the respectful hush of a theater. It was the nervous quiet of a crowd realizing they were no longer in control of the experience. There was no countdown. There was no pyrotechnics. There was just the sudden, violent intrusion of a static hiss over the PA system, a sound so loud and abrasive that children covered their ears. It was the sound of a signal being hijacked, a frequency being forced open. And in that uncomfortable, ear-splitting noise, the feeling of entertainment evaporated, replaced by the cold, sinking realization that the ghosts of the past never truly leave the building. They just wait in the shadows for the right moment to reclaim their haunt. When the static finally cut, it didn't transition into a recognizable bass line or a catchy pop anthem. It snapped into a solitary, distorted melody, a warped, slowed-down version of a song that hadn't been heard in this arena for nearly a decade. A recognition didn't hit the crowd all at once. It started as a murmur in the lower bowl, a ripple of disbelief that spread upward as the brain tried to reconcile the impossible audio with the reality of the year. This was a song associated with a different era, a different regime, and a bridge that was supposed to be incinerated. The giant screen remained pitch black, refusing to give the audience the comfort of a nameplate. There was just the music, playing like a music box winding down in an empty room, stripping away the gloss of modern production to reveal something raw and unpolished. The commentary team stopped speaking entirely. There was no, "Oh my God," or forced enthusiasm. There was only the sound of Michael Cole taking a sharp, audible breath, a reaction that wasn't fed to him through a headset. Then she walked out. There was no smoke, no rising platform, no carefully choreographed pose. She simply stepped through the curtain and onto the stage, illuminated by a single, pale spotlight that followed her like a prison searchlight. She wasn't wearing wrestling gear. She was dressed in street-clothes combat boots, ripped jeans, and a leather jacket that looked like it had seen years of wear. Her hair was down, messy, shielding her face. She didn't look at the camera. She didn't acknowledge the crowd. She just began to walk down the ramp with a terrifying sense of purpose. It was a skipping cadence, a ghost of her old persona, but stripped of the playfulness. It was the walk of someone who was marching to a funeral, possibly her own, possibly the division's. The camera zoomed in, trying to catch her eyes, but she kept her head low. The energy in the building wasn't a pop, it was a collective gasp, a vacuum of air being sucked out of the lungs of 50,000 people, followed by a low, guttural roar that sounded more like shock than joy. As she reached the bottom of the ramp, she paused. She looked at the steel steps as if they were a foreign object, then slowly ascended. The champion in the ring had backed away into the corner, clutching the title belt not as a prize, but as a shield. This was the moment the script officially dissolved. The intruder didn't do her signature pose on the apron. She didn't smile. She slid under the bottom rope with a fluidity that made it look like she had never left, yet the movement was sharper, more violent. She stood up in the center of the ring and finally, slowly lifted her head. The camera caught the expression, not the manic pixie smile of the past, but a cold, dead-eyed stare that pierced through the lens. Her eyes were red-rimmed, devoid of makeup, looking exhausted and dangerous. It was the face of someone who had survived the wilderness and had returned not to play the game, but to flip the board over. The silence in the arena was deafening, a heavy blanket of tension that made every movement feel catastrophic. The confrontation that followed was a masterclass in negative space. In an industry built on high spots and rapid-fire verbal jousting, nothing happened for a distinct, agonizing minute. She stood center ring, a black hole absorbing all the light and energy in the room. The champion, a woman who had built her reputation on dominance and power, looked suddenly small. It wasn't physical size. It was gravitational weight. The returning exile didn't ask for a microphone. When the ring announcer tried to hand her one, she simply stared at his hand until he lowered it and backed away, exiting the ring with a haste that betrayed his genuine discomfort. She didn't need words. The history written on her face was a louder promo than anything that could be scripted by a team of writers. She began to circle the champion, moving with a predatory grace, her eyes scanning the gold belt with a mixture of contempt and familiarity. The crowd, usually desperate to hijack moments with chants, was paralyzed. They started a chant of her name, but it died out quickly, suffocated by the intensity of the standoff. This didn't feel like a wrestling match setup. It felt like a domestic dispute spilling out onto the street. The champion finally stepped forward, trying to assert dominance, puffing her chest out and raising the title. It was a reflex, a conditioned response to a threat. In return, the exile didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head, a smirk ghosting across her lips. It's not a happy smile, but a cruel recognition of the fear beneath the bravado. She reached out, her hand hovering over the title belt. The champion flinched. That single and voluntary micro-movement destroyed the champion's aura in a fraction of a second. The exile saw it. The crowd saw it. The commentary team saw it and remained silent, letting the visual storytelling breathe. Then came the physical contact. It wasn't a finisher. It wasn't a slap. She simply placed her hand on the champion's shoulder, a gesture that was patronizingly gentle. She leaned in, whispering something off mic. The camera strained to pick up the audio, but it was lost. Whatever was said caused the champion's eyes to widen, her posture collapsing slightly. The exile patted her shoulder twice, hardened, then turned her back. It was the ultimate insult. To turn your back on the champion is to declare them unworthy of your attention. As she walked toward the ropes, the champion lunged, a desperate attempt to regain control. The counter was instantaneous. The exile spun, not with a wrestling move, but with a raw, chaotic takedown, driving the champion into the mat with a thud that echoed through the silent arena. She didn't follow up. She didn't go for a pin. She just stood over the fallen body, looking down with an expression of profound disappointment, as if she had expected a war and found only a skirmish. The broadcast cut away not to a commercial, but to a shaky, handheld camera shot backstage, breaking the fourth wall in a way that felt frantic and unplanned. We saw the gorilla position, the nerve center of the show, in a state of absolute disarray. Usually this area is hidden, a sanctum of order. Now we saw producers scrambling, headsets being thrown, and road agents shouting over one another. The camera caught a glimpse of the chief content officer, his face pale, hands on his hips, staring at a monitor with a look that suggested he had lost control of the monster he had agreed to recreate. This wasn't the polished reality-era aesthetic. This was the chaotic vibration of a live event gone off the rails. The shot panned down the hallway, where the women's locker room was beginning to spill out. The roster wasn't standing in their assigned viewing spots. They were huddled in clusters, whispering, their faces a mix of excitement and genuine terror. The return of this specific figure didn't just add a name to the roster, it destabilized the entire ecosystem. We saw the current top stars, the women who had carried the division for years, looking at the monitors with crossed arms and clenched jaws. This wasn't a legend returning for a nostalgia pop. This was a wolf returning to a pen of domesticated dogs. The narrative had shifted instantly from who will win the title to who will survive her. Social media graphics began popping up on the lower third of the screen. Not the usual curated tweets, but blurry screenshots of trending topics that were exploding worldwide. The internet was melting down, debating whether this was a work, a shoot, or a mistake. The lines were blurred so aggressively that the audience at home felt like they were witnessing a crime scene rather than a sporting event. Back in the arena, the exile was exiting through the crowd, ignoring the ramp entirely. She pushed past security guards who looked unsure if they were allowed to touch her. She moved through the sea of fans, some reaching out to touch her, others pulling back as if she were radioactive. She didn't high-five anyone. She didn't acknowledge the signs. She was an island of volatility in a sea of confusion. Commentary finally broke their silence, but their voices were somber, speaking in low tones about implications and consequences rather than hype. They sounded like news anchors reporting on a natural disaster. The camera followed her all the way to the concourse, a gritty, unlit shot of her disappearing into the shadows of the arena tunnels, leaving the brightly lit ring behind her as a hollow, meaningless stage. The message was clear. The show was in the ring, but the reality was walking out the door, and she was taking the oxygen with her. As the show prepared to go off the air, the camera lingered on the empty ring. The champion was gone, helped to the back by referees. The crowd remained, refusing to leave, staring at the empty entryway, as if expecting an encore or an explanation. The final sequence of the night wasn't a match, but a video package that seemed to be edited in real time, a montage of the exile's career. Not the triumphs, but the trauma. We saw the injuries, the public breakdowns, the scathing promos of the past, the tears, and the exits. It was a bleak reminder that this return wasn't a triumph, it was a relapse. The music played softly melancholic piano notes that clashed with the violence on the screen. It framed her not as a hero returning to save the day, but as a tragic figure drawn back to the only place that understood her, even if that place was destined to destroy her. The screen faded to black, but then a final scene cut in, a digital exclusive forced onto the main broadcast. It was a shot of her sitting alone in a hallway, the leather jacket discarded, her head in her hands. She looked small, vulnerable, and infinitely tired. A producer, off camera, asked the question that every fan was screaming at their screen. Why? Why come back now? She didn't answer immediately. She lifted her head, and for the first time the mask slipped. The anger was gone, replaced by a haunting sorrow. She looked directly into the lens, breaking the distance between the performer and the viewer. Because, she whispered, her voice cracking, I forgot how to be anything else. It wasn't a catchphrase. It was a confession. The screen cut to black for the final time, leaving the copyright logo to fade in over absolute silence. There was no upbeat outro music. I'll remind her to tune in next week. Just the heavy, sinking feeling in the gut of the viewer. The realization hit slowly. This wasn't about a championship belt. It was about addiction. The addiction to the spotlight, to the adrenaline, to the pain. We had cheered for her return, demanded it for years, tweeted about it, and fantasized about the dream matches. But in getting what we wanted, we had forced a human being back into the fire that had almost burned her alive once before. The thrill of the surprise was gone, replaced by a deep ethical discomfort. We wanted the moment. We got the moment. But as the screen stayed dark, the question lingered in the silence of millions of living rooms. We prayed for her to come back, but did we ever stop to ask if she should?